The 19th century is a time of violent global imperial competition. The scramble for Africa and the great game between the Russian and British empires over influence in Central Asia are among the best known examples. But the second half of the century also involved another great game, the great game for Asia. The origins of the clash of empires in East Asia lay in the arrival of foreign powers, European, Russian, and American. Europeans had been in contact with East Asian societies for centuries, but from the mid-19th century, the relationship changed. The more technologically advanced and better organized foreigners imposed unequal economic treaties on China, Korea, and Japan. And in China, foreign businessmen, missionaries, and diplomats enjoy a privileged status beyond the reach of Chinese laws. The Western powers also imposed their will by defeating China in the two Opium Wars, which saw French and British troops sack Beijing in 1860. At the same time, China is racked by civil war in the 1850s and early 1860s, and then in 1884-85, France again defeats China in a brief conflict over influence in Vietnam. China had been the regional power for thousands of years, but now it was too weak to even protect its own sovereignty against the smaller outside powers that Chinese elites had long considered barbarians. The foreign powers also quarreled amongst themselves for economic advantage and for control over resources by using railway lines in China that they built and owned. Britain and Russia's Central Asian Great Game even spills over into East Asia in 1885 as the British occupy a Korean island, causing a brief war scare. In China, the Qing dynasty and its advisors scramble to find a solution to the unthinkable: that foreign barbarians are more powerful than their celestial empire. They introduce a series of administrative and military reforms, and Chinese thinkers develop the self-strengthening movement to find solutions to the crisis. Leaders like Li Hongzhang push for a new army, schools, factories, shipbuilding dockyards, and the application of science in industry. But the central government is weak, and regional warlords are often willing to cooperate with the foreigners at the expense of Beijing, and they withhold badly needed tax revenue as well. Most of the people are desperately poor, and banditry becomes a widespread problem. The danger of local rebellions forces the Qing to accept the existence of regional armies that they don't fully control to put them down. In Japan, US warships enforced trade relations from the 1850s, and in the 1860s, foreign warships bombard Japanese ports several times over economic disputes. Once the Japanese Civil War ends and the Meiji Emperor consolidates power in 1869, the authorities launch a much more radical program of modernization and, at first, westernization. Their army models itself on the Germans, their navy on the British, and Japanese ports and factories soon develop at breakneck pace. The speed of the change astonished outsiders like journalist George Rittner. In less than 20 years, Japan has acquired the knowledge it has taken us centuries to learn. Japan's imperial ambitions grow too, in part to imitate Western practices, but also due to the ideas of Japanese superiority and natural right to rule over other Asian peoples. The rapid change causes tensions. Most Japanese are poor, and rural people suffer under heavy taxes. The initial push to westernize culture also faces backlash from conservatives, so the authorities eventually focus on military and economic aspects, though they keep any Western practices they think will give them an advantage against competitors, like military uniforms. The country begins to expand its territorial control as well, adding the Ryukyu Islands and extending control over all the Kurile Islands in an exchange with Russia for Sakhalin. Russian expansion in the region also spikes tensions in the East Asian Great Game. In the 1830s and 1840s, some Russian writers and politicians become convinced that Russia has a special soul and a special mission as a civilization separate from East and West. After St. Petersburg's defeat in the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Tsar's forces turned their attention to Asia to re-establish their prestige. General Ivan Blaramberg speaks for many when he says, "Russia's future does not lie in Europe. It must look to the East." From the 1860s to the 1880s, Russia completes the conquest of Central Asia, spurring the original Great Game with the British. They even briefly seize the Ili region in western China. but it's Russia's actions in the so-called Far East that help create a second great game there. They occupy and annex the Amur and Pacific Coast regions from China after the Opium Wars had weakened the Chinese, and they found a naval base at a fishing village that they renamed Vladivostok, meaning ruler of the East. They also set to building the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1891, which brings the prospect of Russian power being directly projected into the heart of East Asia. The planned route passes through Chinese Manchuria and right next to the Kingdom of Korea, which makes the Chinese and Japanese nervous. So by the 1890s, Russian expansion, Japanese imperial ambitions, and traditional Chinese interests spark a Korea-focused Asian Great Game, a game that drags the region into war over Korea. Japan and China see the Korean peninsula as essential to their security and prestige, and both intervene in Korean affairs in the last third of the century. Domestically, Korea is in crisis. Decades of bitter elite rivalries lead to power struggles within the Joseon dynasty between King Kojong and Queen Min and the king's father, known as the Taewon-gun. One of the questions fueling the tensions is Korea's relationship to the outside world. It's known as the Hermit Kingdom for its isolation, even though Korea is formally a tributary of the Chinese Qing Empire. In the 1870s and 1880s, reformers looked to modernizing Japan as a model, while Confucian-minded conservatives value ties with China, and numerous popular rebellions oppose corrupt royal officials or outside influence. China and Japan both worry about instability in Korea. China even tries to impose what some have called a modern form of Qing imperialism in the 1880s, which influential Chinese Viceroy Li Hongjiang sums up this way. For China, Korea is a dependent of China. For all others, Korea is independent. Tokyo, however, insists it has interests in Korea and pressures the Qing into diplomatic compromises in the 1880s. There are even 2 brief war scares. In the end, China accepts that Japan has a role in decisions relating to Korea that it deems important for its security. By 1894, the Korean carousel of coups and rebellions has left King Kojong at the head of a weak and corrupt government. Meanwhile, a religious movement known as the Tonggaks has gained followers. Founded by Choi Jae-woo, they combine ideas from Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, an opposition to what they see as the dynasty's moral degeneracy and Western influence. In February, they rise up to protest abuse by corrupt local government officials in the south. Government troops are too weak to deal with the rebels, so the king asks China for help. Beijing sends a small force in June and informs the Japanese as per an 1885 agreement, but only after they've set sail for the port of Asan. Japan considers this a breach of the agreement and sends its own troops. Ironically, the rebellion ends June 11th. China's representative in Korea, Yuan Shikai, proposes a withdrawal, but Japanese Prime Minister Hirobumi Ito is under pressure from hawkish ministers and patriotic newspapers. Ito doesn't want to be seen as too aggressive by the British, since Tokyo and London are about to end their unequal commercial treaty. So the Japanese say that their troops will stay until Korea enacts reforms to deal with the causes of the rebellion. China's top diplomat, Viceroy Li, asks the British and Russians to mediate, according to the Chinese diplomatic strategy of using barbarians against barbarians. But they refuse. He wants to avoid war, as he has doubts about China's military readiness, and because he knows the Dowager Empress Cixi has diverted funds from the navy to build a new palace for her upcoming birthday. Qing Emperor Guangxu, on the other hand, briefly considers war with Japan to overcome the influence of his maternal aunt, the Empress Dowager, but most of his ministers oppose him. He does, however, send more troops to Korea. Tokyo now sees war as inevitable. So on July 19th, its envoy to Korea, Keisuke Otori, demands that King Kojong expel the Chinese and adopt reforms to show Korea's independence from China. On July 23rd, Japanese troops force the king to accept the leadership of his father. 2 days later, Japanese warships attack Chinese naval forces in the Battle of Pengdo, in which the Japanese sink a Chinese cruiser and a troop ship with 1,000 men on board. Beijing declares war on August 1, 1894, and the First Sino-Japanese War officially begins. Many Japanese, even liberal-minded thinkers, greet the war with enthusiasm. Supporters frame the conflict as a clash of the New World versus the decrepit Old Order, or as part of a battle to advance civilization in Asia, an assessment shared by many in the West who hold anti-Chinese views. China is still much larger and has more resources than Japan, and not all Japanese officers are confident. China's military, though, is not centralized, with local governors controlling regional forces who must plunder from civilians to survive and who are rarely trained in modern warfare. Li was one of the Chinese reformers pushing for military modernization and helped create two of China's best armed forces: the Beiyang Fleet, which has two German-built, large modern battleships to which the Japanese have no equivalent, and the small Huai Army, which has modern equipment and some Western training. Japanese forces are better armed, trained, and supplied, and are led by Japanese officers who've studied Western warfighting. For years, Tokyo has reallocated funds from the imperial court and into the army and navy, and in June 1894 even cracks Chinese diplomatic and military codes. The Japanese plan is to secure their lines of communication in Korea, get control of the Yellow Sea, expel the Chinese from Korea, and then carry the war into Manchuria and possibly even overthrow the Qing Empire. The Chinese want to surround the Japanese units in Seoul as a first step in maintaining their influence in Korea, but the Japanese are quicker. Japanese troops start moving on July 28, before the formal start of the war, and they defeat the Chinese in a skirmish at the village of Songhuan that night. Chinese General Ye Zhiqiao wants to stand at Asan, but he now learns of the loss of expected reinforcements at sea, and faulty intelligence leads him to overestimate Japanese numbers. So the Chinese abandon southern Korea altogether and march 250 kilometers north to Pyongyang, living off the land as they go. The city is well protected by a river, hills, forts, cliffs, walls, and Chinese earthwork defenses. Japanese General Yamagata Aritomo plans to surprise the Chinese by storming the city from all four sides. Meanwhile, General Ye reduces patrols after a friendly fire incident, so the Chinese don't detect the Japanese preparations on the landward side. On September 14th, supported by 4 gunboats, the Japanese assault begins. The Chinese don't take the opportunity to hit the Japanese as they cross the river, but they do counterattack fiercely with cavalry charges. The next day, Japanese reinforcements arrive in the hills to the north and join the battle, surprising the Chinese as planned and capturing the city's northern gate. General Ye tells the Japanese he will surrender the next morning, but also orders the garrison to escape overnight. But the withdrawal goes terribly wrong. Chinese officer Lu Shushan describes the panic. Those Chinese soldiers who were in the front were fired upon by the Japanese and started to retreat, but those in the back wanted to rush forward. It was so dark and crowded that one could not distinguish between enemies and friends. So all the Chinese took out their weapons and began fighting each other. Some even killed themselves out of sheer terror. The fragmented Chinese command under 4 generals prevents effective action, and there are rumors that the Chinese Manchu troops fled first, while the Chinese Muslim units fight to the end. The Japanese take Pyongyang in just 2 days, capturing large quantities of weapons, supplies, and horses, and suffering just 160 dead against 2,000 Chinese dead and 700 prisoners, whom the Japanese treat well. Despite the defeats on land in Korea, China's Beiyang Fleet still controls the Yellow Sea and access to Manchuria and Korea's west coast, but its commanders make no effort to take the fight to the Japanese. On September 17th, the Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Sukeyuki Ito sights the Chinese by chance near Haiyang Island. Chinese Admiral Ding Ruchang struggles to get his ships into formation. When the Japanese close in and switch from a column to a diagonal line, Ding should react, but instead his second-in-command, Commodore Liu, spontaneously orders the flagship's main guns to fire. The concussion knocks the unsuspecting Admiral Ding and his British advisor, Vice Admiral William Tyler, unconscious at a critical moment. Tyler later comments on the incident. What was the explanation of the Commodore's act in opening fire while the Admiral and I were standing well in sight over the 10-inch guns? I never knew, and I never heard the thing discussed. With the admiral incapacitated, the Japanese concentrate their fire on the weaker Chinese vessels and set them ablaze. Japanese gunners then focus on the 2 Chinese battleships, knocking out the communications on the flagship Dingguan. Japanese shells kill so many Chinese sailors they can barely keep their 2 capital ships in the fight, but they remain afloat. Admiral Ito eventually decides to break off the fight after his flagship is also hit. Chinese officers falsify reports as they had after Pyongyang, a common practice for fear of facing execution. Emperor Guangxu appoints Prince Gong to run the war effort and strips Li's prestigious honors of the 3 peacock feather and yellow riding jacket, and Empress Cixi decides on a modest birthday party. The Japanese have sunk 5 Chinese ships for just 3 damaged of their own, crippling the Beiyang fleet. After 2 major victories within days of each other, the Japanese now push into Chinese territory. In late October, General Yamagata's First Army crosses the Yalu River and moves towards the historical Manchu capital of Shenyang, while General Oyama's 24,000-strong Second Army lands on the Liaodong Peninsula to attack China's most important naval base at Port Arthur. Shenyang is important to the Manchu Qing court, but Port Arthur is militarily crucial as the only base where Chinese ships can be repaired. It's protected by modern forts on the approaches to the city, but the Japanese quickly take them. Japanese land and naval forces surround Port Arthur, and Oyama calls on Chinese General Wei Rucheng to surrender. Wei's answer is a counterattack out of the town, but the Japanese stop it and capture all the remaining inland forts in a few hours. Superior Japanese firepower, discipline, mobility, and leadership carry the day, just as they did at Pyongyang and the Yellow Sea. A foreign observer recalls the one-sided fight. At the ramparts, not a Chinaman remained. They fled from fort to fort along the high wall, firing as they went, and making a stand at every point till too close for rifles. All over the hills, they were chased, and for many miles around, hardly 100 yards could be passed without sight of a Chinese corpse. Chinese commanders disguise themselves and flee, and Japanese troops enter the city November 21st. Until now, the Japanese have behaved well towards defeated enemies, but now Japanese units are gripped by rumors of Chinese soldiers in civilian clothing, and of civilians shooting at them, and they're enraged that the Chinese have strung up the heads of Japanese soldiers killed before the city fell. The result is a 3-day massacre inside and outside Port Arthur. Soldier Okabe Makio of the 1st Division writes in his diary, "As we entered the town of Port Arthur, we saw the head of a Japanese soldier displayed on a wooden stake. This filled us with rage and a desire to crush any Chinese soldier. Anyone we saw in the town, we killed. The streets were filled with corpses, so many they blocked our way. We killed people in their homes. By and large, there wasn't a single house without from 3 to 6 dead. Blood was flowing and the smell was awful. We sent out search parties. We shot some and hacked at others. The Chinese troops just dropped their arms and fled. Firing and slashing, it was unbounded joy. At this time, our artillery troops were at the rear, giving 3 banzai cheers for the emperor." Foreign journalists like Canadian James Creelman of the New York World also witnessed the Japanese killing some women and children as well. Estimates of the death toll vary greatly, from 2,000 or 3,000 victims to unlikely claims of 60,000 in some US newspapers at the time. The reports of the massacre put Tokyo's international political goals at risk, since the US Congress is about to debate a fairer commercial treaty with Japan. Japanese Foreign Minister Munemitsu Mutsu fears that the new treaties might not be approved if Japan is seen as uncivilized. So Tokyo funds a disinformation campaign in the American and British press to cast doubt on the accusations. The Japanese campaign convinces many American politicians that the reports are overblown. Some American eyewitnesses change their accounts, and Congress approves the treaty in February 1895. As Japan does damage control in the US, in Korea, the Japanese position gets more complicated in the kingdom now said to have 2 kings. Japan said it started the war to ensure Korea's independence from China, but in practice, it wants control. Japan put the king's father back in power in July, but he and other conservatives opposed Japanese-sponsored reforms. In August, the Taewon-gun asked the Chinese for help. Chinese troops in Korea will provide an occasion for our deliverance. I hope that the Celestial Empire will extend protection to our dynasty and court by sweeping away the traitors in the current regime who are selling the country to the Japanese. He also later approaches the Russian legation and plans to assassinate Japan-friendly Korean opponents. When the Japanese uncover the plot, they promptly remove him from power. The Taewon-gun then calls upon the Tonggak rebels to rise up again. Despite divisions between radical and moderate Tonggaks, brutal Japanese military requisitioning and continued abuses by Korean officials convinced them and local peasants to answer the call. On October 12th, the Tonggaks declare a general rebellion, which evolves into a messy civil war involving the Tonggaks, Japanese troops, government forces, and local government-aligned militias known as minpos. The fighting is brutal, including the traditional practice of beheading or mutilating the dead and scorched earth policies. Chronicler Hwang Hyun describes a rebel attack against government and minpo troops. The minpos were excellent marksmen. The bullets came raining down upon the bandits, and the entire valley was quickly filled with corpses. The next day, however, the bandits mustered their men and entered Hadong, and burned down 10 civilian households, declaring that they would kill all hiding minpo. They then pillaged the nearby villages. Tokyo sends reinforcements, and a 3,000-strong Japanese-Korean government force marches south, smaller but much better equipped than the 10,000 Tonggaks, who are spread out and mostly armed with matchlock muskets and bamboo spears. In November and December, Japanese-led forces inflict a series of battlefield defeats on the Tonggaks. Another Japanese force moves west from Pusan, trapping the rebels. The Japanese spare few of the enemy. Today we caught 7 Tonggak peasants who were left in the village, lined them up in the fields outside of the castle, attached bayonets to guns, and with the command of Lieutenant Morita, stabbed the victims at the same time. The Korean soldiers watching nearby were surprised and shocked. The last Tonggaks, including one of the leaders, Chon Bong-jun, surrender in January 1895, but Korea is still bitterly divided. As the Japanese are putting down the Tonggak rebellion, the Qing court is looking to make peace. There's also turmoil in China, as Li's opponents look to capitalize on his defeats, and several generals are executed. In November 1894 and January 1895, Li asks for talks, but the Japanese suspect the Chinese are stalling in the hope that a Western power will intervene, so they remain on the offensive. General Yamagata's move towards Shenyang continues, and he takes Haicheng December 13th. The Chinese launch numerous counterattacks in the bitter cold, and although they cannot retake the city, they inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese and stop their advance. The Japanese now turn to China's last naval base at Weihaiwei. The Chinese cannot challenge the Japanese on the open sea, but the Beiyang fleet's 4 combat-ready warships might threaten an enemy landing near Beijing. Japanese troops land near Weihaiwei in January and easily capture some of the outlying forts, their guns, and the walled town itself. Only the naval headquarters on Lugongdao Island remains, so Japanese Admiral Ito writes Chinese Admiral Ding and urges him to defect. I believe your wisest course is to come to Japan and wait there until the fortunes of your country are again in the ascent. Will you throw in your lot with a country that you see falling to ruin? Or will you preserve the strength that remains to you and evolve another plan hereafter? Ding does not respond, but tries and fails to retake one of the forts in early February. Japanese torpedo boats then sink the flagship Ding-1 and another vessel, and Li telegraphs Ding that no help is coming. The admiral negotiates safe passage for his men and then commits suicide. The Japanese honor the agreement, and the Matsushima fires a salute in honor of Ding. Peace talks begin in April 1895 in Japan, but they're interrupted for a week when a Japanese civilian shoots Li in the face. The Chinese diplomat recovers, and on April 17th, the two sides signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki. China recognizes Korean autonomy, agrees to pay Japan a large indemnity, opens several major cities to Japanese trade, and grants Japan the same preferential trade status as the Western powers. China also cedes to Japan the Pescadores Islands, the Liaodong Peninsula including Port Arthur, and the island of Formosa, today's Taiwan. The inhabitants of Formosa, though, rise up against the Japanese occupation in a 5-month insurgency. The First Sino-Japanese War has led to the deaths of about 20,000 Japanese, 30,000 Chinese, and between 30 and 50,000 Koreans, devastating the country. The Hansong Sunbo newspaper sums up the tragedy for the people of Korea. The innocent people who were killed are to be pitied, as well as those who are yet alive. For the Chinese, the war shows the failure of modernization efforts and comes as a deep shock, including for Li. Affairs in my country have been so confined by tradition that I could not accomplish what I desired. Now, in a twinkling of an eye, 10 years have gone by, and everything is still the same. I am ashamed of having excessive wishes and lacking the power to fulfill them. After centuries as East Asia's cultural and political center, China has been easily crushed by a smaller power that had been in its Confucian cultural orbit, which will cause more internal strife and a new push for economic concessions by Western powers. Japanese joy at their victory, new status as a great power, and hopes for equality with the West do not last long. In May, Russia, France, and Germany staged the Triple Intervention. They argue that Japanese control of the Liaodong Peninsula is a threat to Korea's independence, China, and Russia. Russian Minister Sergei Witte even threatens military action. Japan's hostile activities on the continent were directed mainly against Russia. The planned takeover of southern Manchuria will be a threat to all of us and will probably result in all of Korea being absorbed by Japan. If Japan could not be persuaded to relinquish its claim to the Liaodong Peninsula, Russia should begin hostile actions against the Japanese fleet and bombard Japanese ports. The so-called Far East is now a central part of international affairs. Tokyo reluctantly agrees to give back the peninsula to China. Japanese public opinion, though, is outraged, even more so when in 1898 Russia pressures China into leasing it the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, along with a railway deal in Manchuria. Japanese journalist Soho Tokutomi, once a supporter of liberal principles, wants revenge. Japan will break the global monopoly of the Western race, destroy their special privileges, and bring an end to the special influence and global tyranny of the whites. Japan's plans for dominating post-war Korea also run into a Russian roadblock. Japanese agents assassinate Queen Min and bring back the Taewon-gun, only to see Russia help King Kojong regain power in 1896. The tensions between the Russian and Japanese empires will grow in the following years until the Asian Great Game explodes into war again. The rivalry between Japan and the great powers would culminate in the Japanese invasion of the Western colonies in Southeast Asia in late 1941. One of them was the American-ruled Philippines, where Japan defeated the US forces and captured many after a month-long siege. In 1944, the US, under Commander Douglas MacArthur, started to liberate the Philippine Islands again. During their campaign, they launched multiple daring raids to free prisoners of war. If you want to learn more about the raid of the Cabanatuan prison camp in early 1945, check out our new series, History's Most Daring Raids. And where can you watch History's Most Daring Raids? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building with other creators where you don't need to sift through a deluge of AI slop. Nebula is made and curated by humans, and it's available in 4K resolution on your browser, on your smartphone, smart TV, or streaming box like Apple TV or Roku. And that's not all. On Nebula, you can also watch all our regular videos ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. If you go to nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can get an entire year of Nebula for just $30. Nebula is also a great gift, by the way. Just go to gift.nebula.tv/realtimehistory to give an entire year to family and friends, even if they already have an account. Whether you watch Nebula on your own or give it to someone else, you're supporting us here at Real Time History directly. China is still reeling from its humiliating defeat against Japan when tensions with Western powers erupt into another armed conflict that sees foreign troops on Chinese soil, the Boxer Uprising. By the late 1890s, the Chinese Qing Empire has been rocked by a string of disasters: a brutal civil war, military defeats by the West, Russia and Japan, and lost territories. Foreign powers forced Qing officials to sign unequal economic treaties, in spite of a US proposal for free trade. In response, Chinese intellectuals and politicians promote a self-strengthening movement to catch up with the foreign powers. And in 1898, the Guangxu Emperor launches a hasty 100-day reform program. But the more influential Dowager Empress Cixi opposes it, and the plan fails. Meanwhile, Western and Russian companies build railways and mines and establish the legation quarters, special districts in Chinese cities for foreigners. The railways and other new technology disrupt the Chinese economy, throwing millions into unemployment and poverty. European and American Christian missionaries also bring change. By the mid-1890s, more than 2,000 missionaries have converted nearly 600,000 Chinese. Missionaries reject Qing court's authorities and use their influence to protect Chinese Christians in legal disputes with non-Christians. They also oppose traditional ancestor worship, and some claim equality with Chinese governors or viceroys. This angers local landowners, traditionalists, and peasants. Some Chinese turn to secret societies for help against roaming bandits or privileged foreigners and converts, and the Big Sword Society kills 2 German missionaries in Shandong province in 1897. It is in Shandong province that the biggest secret society forms. They practice martial arts and call themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, but foreigners know them as the Boxers. The region is suffering from economic dislocation, religious tensions, the 1898 Yellow River flood, and the 1899 drought. Some believe the flood foretells the coming fall of the Qing dynasty. Refugees, unemployed young peasant men, and some landowners are drawn to the Boxers' message. The foreign devils are starting missions, erecting telegraphs, and building railways. They do not believe in the sacred doctrine, and they speak evil of the gods. Their sins are numberless as the hairs of the head. The will of heaven is that the telegraph wires be first cut, then the railways torn up, and then shall the foreign devils be decapitated. The Boxers also blame missionaries for the drought. No rain comes from heaven, the earth is parched and dry, and all because the churches have bottled up the sky. The Boxers are decentralized with many local groups. There's no overall leader. They believe they can call on gods to possess them and protect them in battle, and practice rituals including chanting and prostrating themselves. Boxers mostly target Chinese converts and Chinese working for foreign railways or businesses. They draw attention by clashing with Qing troops despite their slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigners," and by killing British missionary Sidney Brooks in December 1899. The movement spreads quickly, reaching Beijing in May 1900. Western missionaries and diplomats complain to their governments, who pressure the Qing to crack down. Some Russians, though, say they sympathize with the Boxers. What is happening in China is really a people's war. As Russians, we cannot deny the great significance of people's wars. In 1812, we won a people's war against Europe and crossed its territory to the very capital of the world, Paris. St. Petersburg, though, does not see things this way, and such statements do not stop Boxers from cutting Russian-controlled rail and telegraph lines in Manchuria. The Dowager Empress Cixi's government publicly threatens the Boxers with harsh punishment, but the movement is too big to control, and the court is split. Moderates like Prince Qing urge restraint, while hardliners like Prince Duan want to use the Boxers against the foreigners. The Dowager Empress adopts an ambiguous policy. Sometimes she labels the Boxers bandits and orders imperial troops to defend the legations, but she also prevents her generals from fully suppressing them. The violence escalates. In Beijing, the Boxers kill many Chinese Christians and then ramp up attacks on foreign missionaries and their churches, schools, and residences. In late May, a few hundred foreign troops, including US Marines, arrived to protect the legations. In response, Boxers cut the Beijing-Tianjin railway. The 500 foreign civilians, 400 soldiers, and 3,000 Chinese Christians now trapped in the legation quarter fear the worst, as American Bessie Ewing writes. We slept in our clothes, ready for instant flight to the Russian legation, and if necessary, from there to the British, as our final stronghold. Cheng Lin comes in to tell me that the American board compound, including the printing press, was first looted and then burned, and that many of our Christians were killed. Foreign forces sometimes strike out from the legations, including one attack on Boxers in a temple that kills 45. The US, Britain, Japan, Russia, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy now form a loose coalition known as the Eight-Nation Alliance. They aim to suppress the Boxers and, as they see it, protect their citizens and property in a lawless China. As they gather warships off the port of Daegu, a message arrives from British Minister in Beijing, Claude Maxwell MacDonald. Situation extremely tense. Unless steps are made for the immediate advance on Peking, it will be too late. Alliance naval officers agreed to send troops to relieve the foreign legations in Beijing. In fact, they'll meet regularly in the next months, marking one of the first efforts at organized coalition warfare in the 20th century. Since their home governments are so far away, the Naval Council often acts independently. British Rear Admiral Edward Seymour leads a 2,000-strong force up the high river from Tianjin, including about 900 British, 450 German, 300 Russian, 150 French, and 100 American troops. Their train convoy leaves on June 10th, but it doesn't get far. Local Boxers rip up sections of track, and a pattern emerges. The expedition stops to repair, and the Boxers ambush them. The Boxers lack heavy weapons and rifles. Many are armed with bamboo spears, large knives, or large muskets known as jingals. At first, they approach Alliance troops slowly, waving banners and performing rituals. When Western bullets cut them down, they adapt, using quick charges or luring Alliance troops to break formation. Still, Alliance firepower, including a Gatling gun, inflicts significant casualties on the Boxers. The Boxers, though, tear up the repaired sections of track behind the expedition, endangering resupply. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Qing court is suspicious of Seymour's incursion. Imperial forces don't try to stop Seymour, but they do plan to mine the high river and reinforce the forts at its mouth at Daegu. Alliance naval officers need the river to send more troops to Beijing, so they demand the Chinese surrender the forts or face attack. Just before the ultimatum runs out on June 17th, Chinese guns open fire on 9 Alliance vessels, which return fire, but the lone American ship stays out of the fight as it has orders not to attack. Within 7 hours, British and Japanese troops storm one fort, naval fire takes out another, and the final 2 surrender. The Alliance now controls the mouth of the Hai, but Seymour is still in trouble. On June 18th, 2,000 Boxers attacked the expedition at Langfang, but this time 3,000 Chinese Muslim soldiers of General Dong Fuxiang's Gansu Braves army joined them. In a sign of things to come, poorly trained Chinese Imperial troops' rifle fire is inaccurate, but the artillery performs well, and they inflict 50 casualties. Seymour retreats towards Tianjin, low on food and ammunition. Before they can reach the city, they capture the Chinese arsenal at Shigu and shelter there, surrounded by 5,000 Imperial Chinese and Boxer troops. So Seymour's expedition has failed, and disappointed foreign residents in Beijing refer to him as Admiral See No More. The Alliance attack on the Daegu forts has succeeded, but it brings serious consequences. For the Qing court, Seymour's expedition and the attack at Daegu are grave violations of China's sovereignty, so the Dowager Empress decides for war. On June 21st, the Emperor issues an edict against the Alliance. For the past 30 years, foreigners have taken advantage of China's forbearance to encroach on China's territory and trample on the Chinese people, and to demand China's wealth. They oppressed peaceful citizens and insulted the gods and holy men. hence the burning of the chapels by patriotic braves. Those others rely on crafty schemes. Our trust is in heaven's justice. They depend on violence, we on humanity. It will not be difficult to vindicate the dignity of our country. But the Qing court's position is weak. They are ethnic Manchus, and some of the majority Han Chinese resent their rule. Others refuse to join the war, like southern provincial governors including Yuan Shikai and Li Hongzhang, who form a mutual defense pact. Confusingly, a week after the war edict, the emperor calls for restoring order and for some Boxers to be arrested. On paper, the Qing have over 300,000 troops available under overall commander Ronglu, but in practice, only about 70,000 are ready to defend Beijing. The weaknesses of the Chinese army, though, make little difference to the foreigners trapped in Beijing, where the siege of the legations begins on June 20th. Just before the war edict, Dowager Empress Cixi instructs the foreigners to leave Beijing under escort of her army. But the foreigners are afraid, and a Manchu soldier kills German diplomat Clemens von Ketteler as he's on his way to meet Chinese officials, less than 2 weeks after Boxers killed a Japanese envoy. Boxers have also burned many buildings in and around the city associated with foreigners or Chinese converts, including burning converts alive inside their churches. The Boxers and Qing forces don't launch an all-out assault, instead slowly constricting the foreign pocket with small-scale attacks, rifle and shell fire, and setting fire to buildings. The Alliance garrison anchors its defense on the 15-meter-high Tartar wall and the northern cathedral, which is defended by French and Italians. Boxers and imperial units advance barricades to inch along the top of the wall and dig underneath the cathedral to set off explosives. The Chinese do make some gains. They capture the French legation thanks to underground mining, and they drive the Germans off the Tartar wall, though a British, Russian, US counterattack regains the position. Future US Marine General Captain John Myers plays a key role in the fighting. American Minister Edwin Conger tries to negotiate, but talks fail, and by mid-July, the trapped foreigners and converts are desperate. The Chinese have the strength to overwhelm their enemy, but they're not decisive. In fact, there's no direct order to besiege the legations. General Ronglu holds back, as he feels China cannot win the war, and his troops even clash with some Boxers and Dong's Gansu braves. As the siege in Beijing continues, the alliance gathers forces to relieve another siege at Tianjin. Soon after Seymour's doomed expedition leaves Tianjin on June 10th, Boxers and Chinese troops under General Nie Shicheng besiege the city's legation quarter and attack Russian troops at the rail station. By the end of June, Alliance troops rescue Seymour's men and relieve the siege of the legations, including future US President Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou, who are among the 700 foreigners freed. But Chinese reinforcements bring their strength up to perhaps 25,000 imperial troops and Boxers, and the attacks continue. American Wendell Brown comments on a Boxer assault. They move toward us led by huge figures in head masks and women in white turbans and red sashes carrying red and black banners. Groups of spearmen carrying red-tasseled spears, jingle crews, swordsmen, riflemen, and archers were flanked by bands of blaring trumpets. Chinese assaults put Alliance forces under extreme pressure, but they hold on. On July 13th, about 7,000 Alliance troops counterattack the city and its 5-meter-thick walls. In principle, they're under British General Arthur Dorward, but there are problems with command and control. In most places, intense Chinese fire, swampy ground, and a lack of cover cause Alliance forces to bog down. The initial assault fails, but overnight, a Japanese military engineer blows up a key gate, and himself, which breaks the Chinese defense. The next day, the city falls. Allied troops loot the town and fire on civilians, causing thousands to flee. They also capture the leader of an all-female Boxer unit, Lin Haier, and probably execute her. She later becomes a Chinese folk hero. The Battle of Tianjin cost the Alliance 750 killed and wounded, nearly half of them Japanese. Thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians are killed, and the town is in ruins. This main street and the surrounding houses were a holocaust of human life. A day later, that long thoroughfare was a slow-moving line of homeless, weeping human beings, their homes in ashes, without food, friendless, and in many cases, their kindred left charred in the ruins of their homes. Tianjin is a close-run battle, but now the Alliance have a secure base for another expedition to Beijing. As Alliance forces plunder Tianjin, diplomats and military planners on both sides spring into action. Even before the loss of Tianjin, the Qing court knows it needs allies, so Emperor Guangxu messages Japanese Emperor Meiji and proposes that he switch sides. Should China be unsuccessful in opposing the West, Japan's independence will also be threatened. So China and Japan are on the same footing and should put their differences aside to preserve their national existence. An alliance with Japan would succeed in dispelling the present troubles and restoring order. Emperor Meiji refuses and urges peace. Several court officials advise the Dowager Empress to make peace as well, but she has them executed and their heads displayed in public. Meanwhile, the alliance gathers an international relief force to march on Beijing. Germany sends fresh troops from Europe, but they'll take many weeks to arrive. Kaiser Wilhelm sees them off with an infamous speech on July 27th. No quarter will be given, prisoners will not be taken. Just as 1,000 years ago, the Huns under their king Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend, may the name German be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever again dare look cross-eyed at a German. Afterwards, the German Foreign Office edits a toned-down version for the press. Back in China, alliance officers argue over who should lead the expedition. The Westerners and Russians don't want to serve under a Japanese, the Japanese don't want a Russian, and the French don't want a German. In the end, Russia supports Germany to spite Britain and Japan, and German General Alfred von Waldersee gets the job, but he won't get to China until September. British and American officers fear a fall start might expose the expedition to harsh winter weather, but the French and Russians argue that the summer heat and rains will be worse. When the British and Americans threaten to go it alone, the others agree to march now. British General Alfred Gazeley takes command of around 22,000 Alliance troops, half of what is considered necessary to take Beijing. 10,000 Japanese, 4,000 Russians, 3,000 British and Indians, 2,000 Americans, 800 French and Indo-Chinese, 200 Germans, and smaller contingents from Austria-Hungary and Italy, and even a British-led Chinese unit. The relief force leaves Tianjin on August 4th, as U.S. Marine officer Smedley Butler observes. French zouaves in red and blue, blonde Germans in pointy helmets, Italian bersaglieri with tossing plumes, Bengal cavalry on Arabian stallions, turbaned Sikhs, Japanese, Russians, and English. The troops suffer badly from the extreme heat. Many drop out from exhaustion, and still others are struck by dysentery. Chinese troops block their path at the town of Peisang behind earthwork positions, and they flood a part of the front line. When Alliance forces attack, the Chinese pin down the French and Russians who are caught on wet ground. But repeated Japanese assaults break the Chinese defense, and they pull back across the river. Casualties are about 1,500 on both sides. The next town Chinese forces choose to defend is Yangtsun, where they prepare similar defenses and flooded zones. This time, the British, Indians, and Americans take the lead. The Chinese fight hard, but their fire is inaccurate. British Indians and Americans compete to be the first into the Chinese line, and once again, Chinese forces retreat as they cannot hold their positions in close-quarter fighting. After Yangtsun, there's little organized Chinese resistance on the road to Beijing, as morale suffers and the Boxers melt away. Imperial advisor Li Bingheng now questions his support for the war. I have seen several tens of thousands of troops jamming all roads. They fled as soon as they heard of the arrival of the enemy. I have experienced many wars, but never saw things like these. Li kills himself the next day. Meanwhile, exhausted Alliance troops leave a, quote, trail of fire and murder in their wake as they march in alternating extreme heat and rain. They make little distinction between civilians, Imperial troops, and Boxers. All are seen as the enemy. Cohesion breaks down, as national contingents often don't coordinate their movements, and on hot days, up to 50% of the men fall behind. British Marine G.F. Cooper will later write, "It was what I should imagine an ice cream in hell would feel like." Still, by August 12th, the remaining half of the relief force reaches Beijing. Alliance leaders agree to attack together, but the Russians rush ahead and attack alone. The Japanese chase after them, followed by the others, as the great game for prestige overshadows military sense. Beijing's walls are massive, and the Chinese defenders stop the Russians and Japanese with heavy losses. But even a disorganized attack is enough against the dispirited Chinese forces. The Chinese commander leaves sections of the wall nearly undefended, and the British quickly reach the legations, followed by the Americans. There's a brief fight at the entrance to the Forbidden City before Japanese troops enter, but the Qing court has already fled. The Alliance conquest of Beijing is a disaster for the Qing, but it's not the only one. Chinese troops and boxers also operate against the Russian presence in Manchuria, attacking rail lines and stations and killing Russians. In July, Chinese guns bombard the border town of Blagoveshchensk. In response, Russian Cossacks and civilians carry out a massacre of hundreds of Chinese civilians, including women and children, near the Amur River. The shooting went on for about half an hour, at which point the riverbank became strewn with a jumble of corpses. After the shooting, the commanding officer gave the order to use hand weapons. The Cossacks used their sabers, and the conscripts were ordered to kill the disobedient Chinese with their axes. The Chinese wept. Some prayed and made the sign of the Orthodox cross, but to no avail. Russian forces then launch an invasion of Manchuria with 100,000 troops. They smash the Manchu banner armies facing them, and fighting rages along the main railway lines. Russian troops burn towns, massacre more civilians, and steal valuable livestock. By October, they take the regional capital of Mukden. In and around Beijing, Alliance occupation forces also loot, rape, and pillage. They burn and shell villages and execute thousands as boxers and Manchu officers, usually without any evidence. Foreign civilians and missionaries join in the looting and denouncing supposed boxers. As in Manchuria, most of these crimes go unpunished. General von Waldersee is frank. If anyone at home is naive enough to believe that Christian culture and customs are being spread here, they'll be sorely disappointed. A comparable destruction has not occurred since the 30 Years' War and the plundering French under Louis XIV in Germany. Alliance troops do offer some humanitarian aid like vaccines and food, but the crush of destitute people seeking help worsens overcrowding. After months of brutal occupation, the Dowager Empress accepts defeat and agrees to the Boxer Protocols in September 1901. China will pay an indemnity of 450 million silver dollars over 39 years, allow Alliance troops to occupy strategic points, create a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, suspend the state civil service examination, renegotiate existing economic treaties, and prohibit anti-foreign groups. China cannot import weapons or materials to make them, must dismantle some fortifications, and must execute pro-Boxer members of the court. They also have to apologize for the killings of Alliance diplomats, build memorials to them, and prohibit Chinese from living in the legation quarters. The protocol is a humiliation for the Qing court, which is badly weakened by its inability to protect China's sovereignty and by heavy losses among the Manchu armies and nobility. Their weakness will soon be put to the test by the Han majority. As for the Boxers, the movement largely disappears. Historians differ as to why, but one plausible explanation is that when the rains finally arrive in August, many Boxers return home to tend their fields, or because they feel their cause has succeeded in ending the drought and breaking the power of the missionaries and converts. The Eight-Nation Alliance makes many mistakes, but defeats China due to Chinese errors and weakness, Western technological superiority, and to some extent, good fortune. The behavior of the relief force and Russian armies in Manchuria, however, creates lasting resentment. Russian forces, in fact, do not leave China as agreed under the protocols, and there's even talk of annexing Manchuria. This further angers the Qing and regional rival Japan, foreshadowing another violent round of the Asian Great Game that will soon begin. China's weakness after defeats in the First Sino-Japanese War and during the foreign intervention during the Boxer Uprising leaves a power vacuum in East Asia. In Manchuria, right next to the strategically central Korean peninsula, the Russians have filled the gap and now base a fleet at the Port Arthur naval base that Japan had conquered from the Chinese in 1894-95, a situation that Japan considers intolerable. In their eyes, Russia is threatening Korea and Japan itself, a so-called dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. So Japan went looking for allies and found one in Great Britain. The British were worried about potential Russian expansion towards British India, so in 1902, Japan and the United Kingdom formed an alliance. This agreement meant that Russia and Japan would face each other one-on-one if it ever came to war. The weak emperors of China and Korea decided it would be best to remain neutral even if fighting broke out on their soil. In 1904, 82% of Japan's national budget went to the military, which had grown to around 400,000 men. The army modeled itself on the Prussian general staff and prioritized education, leadership, and morale. They also tried to replace old clan loyalties with Japanese patriotism. The principal duty of soldiers is loyalty to sovereign and country. It is improbable that anyone born in this country will be wanting in patriotism. But for soldiers, this virtue is so essential that unless a man is strong in patriotism, he will be unfit for service. Remember always that duty is heavier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. The Imperial Japanese Navy modeled itself on Britain's Royal Navy and boasted state-of-the-art British-built capital ships. In 1904, it had the fourth biggest fleet in the world, including 6 battleships and 6 protected cruisers. Britain also cooperated with Japan in intelligence, and the Japanese built an effective network of informants in the Russian Far East. Meanwhile, Russia's military was stagnating. There were some quality units in its 1 million strong army, but only 150,000 of these were in the Far East. The vast majority of the conscripts were poorly trained, motivated, and led. The officer corps was still the product of aristocratic favoritism, and non-noble officers were rare since they were considered politically unreliable. The situation was no better in the Navy. Many sailors came from landlocked provinces with little maritime experience, and they complained that the officers didn't even know their names. In Port Arthur and Vladivostok, the Russians had 7 battleships and 11 cruisers, but these ships were of an older design than those of the Japanese. So the Japanese set out to plan the coming war, and their strategic thinking was dominated by the Navy. Its first strike would be planned in minute detail. Japan's war plan was to defeat the Russian fleet, win decisive battles on land, and then achieve a favorable peace deal. Russia's financial and manpower resources were far greater than Japan's, so the Japanese wanted to win a short war to force the Russians out of Korea and China's Liaodong Peninsula. The Japanese High Command planned to land troops in Korea and then push north into Manchuria. Further landings would cut off Port Arthur and open another line of advance from the Liaodong Peninsula. Japanese troops would then join forces for a major battle and push the Russians back to Harbin. The Japanese hoped that at that point, the United States would intervene diplomatically and broker a peace treaty. But for any of this to work, Japan's maritime supply and logistical routes must be secured. And this meant crippling the Russian Navy in a surprise attack. The Russian government, on the other hand, didn't plan war with Japan, in spite of encouragement from the German Kaiser. St. Petersburg was convinced of its racial superiority, and the Tsar assumed war would break out only if he decided to start one. The Russian chain of command in the Far East was equally unprepared. Minister of War Alexei Kuropatkin was in charge of the military, but in Manchuria, he was subordinate to Viceroy Yevgeny Alexeyev, and the two did not get along. In case of war with Japan, Kuropatkin wanted to retreat and wait for reinforcements from Europe. Alexeyev wanted to stand and fight, and his opinion counted for more since he was the Tsar's favorite uncle. Japan was ready and declared war on Russia on February 8, 1904. But before the declaration arrived in St. Petersburg, the Japanese combined fleet arrived at Port Arthur. The Russian Pacific Fleet was not overly worried about a Japanese attack. The ships had anchored outside the main harbor, and some torpedo nets had been laid, but few ships were on full alert, and many sailors were ashore in Port Arthur's bars. There was even a party on the flagship Petropavlovsk. Admiral Togo Heihachiro was worried that Russian coastal batteries might put his irreplaceable battleships at risk, so he planned a nighttime sneak attack. The capital ships waited at some distance while 10 destroyers armed with torpedoes crept up on the unsuspecting Russian ships in the darkness. At 11:30 p.m., the first 4 Japanese destroyers launched their torpedoes from a distance of 650 meters. 6 missed their targets, but 2 hit the cruisers Pallada and Retvizan. The Russians opened fire on the second group of destroyers, forcing them to fire their torpedoes from 1.5 kilometers away. A Russian sailor recalled the moment the battleship Tsarevich was hit. At 11:38 p.m., the commander heard the order, "Torpedo defense," in the cabin. To get dressed and on deck was a matter of 2 minutes. During this time, they opened fire. Barely on deck, the commander recognized 2 Japanese torpedo boats at the rear and a torpedo aiming at the ship from port. A second later, the explosion occurred. Togo ordered his fleet to close in, but the Russian coastal batteries soon forced the Japanese vessels back. No Japanese ships were lost, but only a few Russian ships were damaged, and all could be repaired. Psychologically, though, the attack had shaken the Russians and achieved its strategic goal, since the cautious Russian commanders ordered their fleet to stay in Port Arthur. This gave the Japanese a free hand to continue landing troops as they'd planned. In fact, before the Port Arthur attack began, the Japanese started landing 3,000 troops in Korea at the international port of Chemulpo. 2 Russian warships watched closely, but couldn't intervene in a neutral port. Eventually, in contravention of international law, the Japanese told the Russian ships they had to leave the harbor or face destruction. The Russians faced impossible odds, but hoisted their battle flags and engaged the Japanese. British Captain Louis Bailey witnessed the scene. Here were 694 Russian officers and men going to almost certain death, for no one expected them, or at any rate many of them, to survive the most unequal conflict. And yet, they had their bands playing and were cheering, and their cheers were heartily returned by about 400 British officers and men, who felt very sorry for them, and admired their pluck in giving battle. The waiting Japanese defeated the Russians in the Battle of Chemulpo Bay, and the Russian commanders scuttled their own ships. The Russo-Japanese War began at sea, but without a decisive engagement. Instead, the focus of the war now shifted to the land. The Japanese First Army landed 42,000 men in Korea and had planned to land more at Daley to cut off Port Arthur. For the additional landing, First Army would have to push back the 19,000 men of the Russian Eastern Detachment along the Yalu and Ai rivers. The first clashes pitted Russian Cossacks against the Japanese in wintry conditions. Despite the Cossacks' fierce reputation, military translator Usa Ogihiko was unimpressed. The Cossack army is an army in name only. In fact, they are nothing more than trick riders. There are several 100,000 Cossacks, but if all of them were to come together, what would they be able to do? They are useless soldiers in a war. The fast-flowing Yalu River was a natural defensive position, but the Russian chain of command was disorganized. Kuropatkin ordered local commander General Mikhail Zasulich to retreat if attacked, while Alexeyev told him to stand firm. Zasulich chose to stay and fight. The Japanese dug artillery pits to hide their guns, and scouts disguised as Korean fishermen reconnoitered Russian positions. The Russians, on the other hand, moved around openly and didn't camouflage their large artillery carriages. Japanese engineers also built a large bridge in plain sight of the Russian artillerymen, who opened fire and exposed their gun positions even further. Japanese counter-battery fire from concealed guns then knocked out many Russian positions before the main attack began. Zasulich expected the Japanese to attack near the wide, shallow mouth of the river within range of their naval guns. Instead, the Japanese used what would become a common tactic in the war. The 12th Division crossed the Yalu quite some distance from the Russian flank. Zasulich thought that this was a feint and held his position, which allowed the 12th Division to capture the high ground and cross the Ai River after fierce fighting. Japanese Captain Takemine recalled, "The fierce battle lasted 3 hours, and all of those who fell were killed or wounded when crossing the Ai River. It is said that the soldiers, standing in the midst of the smoke and bullets, were in high spirits, and with a vigor that could never be seen in ordinary training, they chanted military songs in one voice and kept pace as they advanced. All is as it should be." With the Russian left flank collapsing, on May 1st the Japanese launched a general assault in the center across the Yalu. They drove the Russians from their trenches, where the Japanese artillery fired on them from the heights. Russian forces retreated to the gorges behind the river, which was also a defensible position if it weren't for the confusion in the Russian command. The Japanese poured fire onto the Russian columns, and the 12th Division began to surround them. Lacking clear orders, some Russian units surrendered. The Battle of the Yalu River cost around 2,000 Russian and 900 Japanese lives. Most Russian forces had escaped, but their most important positions in Manchuria were lost. The Japanese landings at Daley went ahead, and it seemed the war was going Japan's way. Foreign banks now began to loan Japan much-needed cash as well. After the battle on the Yalu, the Japanese were in position to move on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur from the landward side. The arrival of Admiral Stepan Makarov at Port Arthur seemed to give the Russians some hope, as he led aggressive naval sorties against the blockading Japanese fleet. But in April 1904, the flagship Petropavlovsk hit a Japanese mine and sank with all hands, including the admiral. In late May, on the narrowest part of the Liaodong Peninsula, Russian forces under General Tretyakov tried to stop the Japanese Second Army's advance towards Port Arthur by making a stand on Nanshan Hill. The Russian defense was hampered by poor intelligence, partly because local Chinese refused to give them information. But they made good use of barbed wire to create killing zones in front of their trenches. The Japanese heavily outnumbered the Russians, but lacked the heavy artillery to destroy the entrenchments. Russian machine gunners mowed down wave after wave of Japanese troops who became entangled in the wire. General Oku pushed on, sending a cryptic order to the 1st Division. "Attack. Expect that all the soldiers will die." The 10th Japanese attack, with the support of coastal gunboats, finally succeeded when a Russian officer prematurely ordered a retreat, creating confusion in the ranks. The Russians had lost about 6,000 men, the Japanese about 1,500, and the Japanese took the city of Dalny. To make matters worse, the Japanese Third Army moved up from Dalny and besieged Port Arthur from the landward side. Japanese commander General Nogi had captured the town in 1 day in the Sino-Japanese War, but in 1904 it would be a harder nut to crack. With concrete defenses, barbed wire, machine guns, and hand grenades, the Russian garrison inflicted heavy losses on the first Japanese assaults. Nogi ordered suicidal human wave attacks, known as Nikudan Kogeki, or human bullets. In a single assault, the Japanese lost 16,000 men. Buddhist chaplain Mamiya Eiju recalled the carnage. Some of them were missing half of their bodies. Some had one arm and one leg removed. Some had their heads torn off with only the skin attached, and some had their shoes filled with the flesh of their feet and were abandoned. When burned, they looked like blackened, rotten fish, and you couldn't know whose son or husband they once were. No illustration of the Buddhist hells has ever portrayed such cruelties. The Japanese government, however, hid the scale of these losses from the public. With Port Arthur under threat, the Tsar ordered Admiral Wilhelm Wittgeft to take his ships and make a run to join the cruiser force at Vladivostok. Wittgeft was not happy about the order, but on August 10th, the Pacific Fleet steamed out with 6 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Admiral Togo's combined fleet had 4 battleships and 2 cruisers along with smaller ships. Togo had previously lost 2 battleships to mines, so he was reluctant to take risks, but he could not allow the Russian fleets to join. The Japanese first tried to sail across the front of the Russians in a maneuver known as crossing the T, but they ended up behind the Russian ships. The Japanese chased the Russians while the fleets exchanged fire, and a heavy Russian 12-inch shell hit Togo's flagship Mikasa. The Mikasa withdrew, but just as the Russians seemed to be slipping away, 2 Japanese 12-inch shells smashed into the Russian flagship Cesarevich. Admiral Witkeft was killed, and the ship jammed in a portward turn. The Russian fleet panicked and lost cohesion, but was saved from disaster when the battleship Retbizan charged at the Japanese. The Pacific Fleet limped back to Port Arthur and decided to wait for reinforcements. Those reinforcements were the Baltic Fleet, which was renamed the Second Pacific Fleet and set off on an epic 8-month journey around the world in October 1904. In a series of battles fought throughout the summer of 1904, the Japanese army gradually drove Russian forces away from Port Arthur to defensive positions around the Manchurian town of Mukden. Then in January 1905, Port Arthur capitulated and Japanese artillery sunk the Russian Pacific Fleet in the harbor. The string of defeats caused much tension amongst the Russians, including between Generals Samsonov and Rennenkampf, whose relations would not improve by the time they commanded at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914. Interestingly, a German military observer of this campaign was Max Hoffmann, who later met the Russian generals again at the same battle during the First World War. Japan had won a string of important victories so far, but they'd also suffered heavy casualties. Russia's much larger reserves meant that it could replace its losses by sending fresh troops east on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now that Port Arthur had fallen, 5 Japanese armies could join for the decisive battle that their army staff had envisioned to avoid a long war. Japanese Commander General Oyama Iwao knew the Russians were planning a counterattack, so he decided to strike first at Mukden. For the coming battle, the Japanese concentrated 200,000 men, 7,300 cavalry, and 1,000 artillery pieces. The 3 Russian armies had around 275,000 men, 16,000 cavalry, and 1,200 artillery pieces. The Japanese, however, had about twice as many machine guns as did the Russians. Oyama planned to once again outflank the Russian position and trap them in a pincer movement so that this time they could not escape. On February 17th, the Japanese army of the Yalu began to move through the hills of the Russian eastern flank. A strong artillery barrage pinned the Russian center, and Kuropatkin assumed the main Japanese thrust was in the east. He shifted his units across the 100-kilometer-long front, which weakened his western flank. And it was in the west that the Japanese Third Army launched its primary effort. General Nogi swung around Mukden to threaten the Russians' lines of retreat. German military observer Captain von Beckmann recorded the Japanese use of machine guns in the advance. The Russian fire was silenced, but broke out again whenever the machine gun fire slackened. The Japanese infantry used these pauses in the enemy's fire to press forward to close range under cover of their own machine gun fire. Russian troops began to panic. Officers tried to organize counterattacks, but the chaos turned into a rout. Fleeing Russian troops burned supplies and looted the remaining vodka. Russian officer Anton Denikin, who would later lead the Whites in the Russian Civil War, recalled the chaos. Individual soldiers, sometimes in small groups, then scattering again, helplessly looked for a way out of the trap. The whole field, as far as the eye could see, was littered with abandoned boxes and heaps of luggage, even from the commander-in-chief's baggage train. Wagons and carts, ambulances, and riderless horses all rushed about in different directions. For the first time in the war, I saw panic. Despite the disaster, Kuropatkin was able to put together a rearguard and prevent total defeat. The fighting had been hard, and the Japanese were once again too exhausted to pursue the weakened Russians. The Japanese had won, but most of the Russian army had escaped, and Japanese casualties were an unsustainable 25%. The Battle of Mukden was likely the largest in history up to that point in terms of troop numbers and ammunition expended. The Japanese fired as much ammo at Mukden as the entire German army in the 6-month-long Franco-Prussian War, and the Russians used even more. The Japanese were again victorious at Mukden, but the land war had turned into a meat grinder that they couldn't continue for long. It was up to the Navy to bring the victory that Japan so desperately needed. The voyage of the Russian Baltic Fleet had taken it around the world, but by the time it reached the theater of war in May 1905, it was in a poor state. Its 29,000-kilometer journey had seen it accidentally fire on British fishing trawlers and face mutinies, refueling problems, and mechanical issues. Its commander, Admiral Zinovy Mad Dog Rojestvensky, even referred to some of his older ships as, quote, self-sinkers. The Japanese fleet was well informed of the Russians' journey and used the time to make repairs and train. Admiral Togo planned to ambush the Russian ships as they passed through the 50-kilometer-wide Tsushima Strait on their way to Vladivostok. Torpedo boats would harass the Russians at night, and the main Japanese fleet would strike the next day. When the Japanese sighted the Russian fleet early on May 27th, the sea was too rough for torpedo boats, so it would be an all-or-nothing attack with the main fleet. That afternoon, the Japanese fleet centered on 4 battleships, 8 armored cruisers, and 4 protected cruisers, crossed in front of the Russian force, led by 8 battleships and 10 cruisers, and performed a bold U-turn on its port side. For Admiral Akiyama Saneyuki, this was the culmination of years of preparation. The Navy had been built up through many years of painstaking work, but it all came to a head in a mere 30-minute maneuver. The decade I spent training in tactics and strategy was also all for the sake of those 30 minutes. It could not have happened without a decade of preparation, so we could think of it as a decade-long war. The Japanese ships steamed obliquely towards the leading Russian vessels and opened fire on the battleships. Both sides scored hits, and the Mikasa was badly hit. The Russians had the heavier guns, but the Japanese had a superior rate of fire and better fire control. The angle of attack also meant that the Russians could only fire from their 4 turrets, while the Japanese could fire broadsides using all available guns. The effect was devastating, as Admiral Rojestvensky recalled. The paint burnt with a clear flame on the steel surfaces. Boats, ropes, hammocks, and woodwork caught fire. Cartridges in the ready racks ignited. Upper works and light guns were swept away. Turrets jammed. In the first hour of battle, the Russian flagship Suvorov was hit and Rojestvensky was wounded. Shortly afterwards, Japanese shells sank the battleship Oslabya, the first modern ship to be sunk by gunnery alone. A Russian sailor on a nearby destroyer watched his comrades abandon ship. The whole of the starboard side as far as the keel was laid bare. Her bright plating looked like the wet scales of some sea monster. And suddenly, as if by command, all the men who crowded to the starboard side jumped down upon these scales. Most of them were dashed against the bilge keel and fell crippled into the sea. In the water, they formed an unimaginable mass, and the enemy's shell never ceased the whole time from bursting over them. A few more seconds, and the Oslabya disappeared beneath the water. The battleship Alexander III charged the Japanese line with all guns blazing, which brought a temporary reprieve for the hard-pressed Russians. At 7 p.m., the battle started up again, and damaged Russian ships were now easy prey. The Japanese sank the Alexander III, then the battleship Borodino. As night fell, Togo sent in his torpedo boats. The next morning, only 2 Russian battleships remained, and the Japanese had surrounded the remnants of the Baltic Fleet. As there was no hope of reaching Vladivostok, the Russian fleet surrendered. The Japanese victory at Tsushima was staggering. 34 of 38 Russian ships were sunk, captured, or interned in neutral ports, including all the battleships. About 5,000 Russian sailors were killed. Japanese losses were 3 torpedo boats and 110 dead. The Russian Navy was all but gone, and Tsar Nicholas II agreed to negotiate peace terms. The United States mediated the peace talks in New Hampshire, and President Teddy Roosevelt was heavily involved. Both belligerents needed to end the war quickly. Japan was victorious, but militarily exhausted, and revolutionary unrest was brewing in Russia. Japanese troops occupied Sakhalin Island in July to pressure the Russians, while the Russians sent fresh divisions to Manchuria in order to pressure the Japanese. Eventually, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on September 5, 1905. Russia would withdraw from Manchuria and the Liaodong Peninsula and grant most of the railway concessions to Japan. South Sakhalin would remain Japanese, while Russia recognized Japanese dominance over nominally independent Korea. Russia, however, refused to pay a war indemnity to now bankrupt Japan. President Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, with the citation referring to Japan as, quote, one of the world's great powers. In Japan, shock at the supposedly lenient treaty led to riots and martial law, but the public was not aware of how tenuous the Japanese position had become. The treaty was not as controversial in Russia, but the defeat strengthened opposition to the autocratic regime and helped spark the 1905 revolution that nearly toppled the Tsar. The Russo-Japanese War was a deadly conflict. About 50,000 Russian and 80,000 Japanese soldiers died in combat or of disease. It also had a global impact, hence the nickname World War Zero. Colonized peoples took inspiration from the defeat of a European power, while Western military observers noted the destructive power of modern weapons like the machine gun. It weakened Russia, made Japan into a major power, and caused some to conclude that modern wars could be won relatively quickly and decisively, developments that would cast a long shadow in the years leading to 1914. After its victory, Japan is the strongest player in the Great Game in East Asia, but the situation in the region remains unstable in the years to come. Japan had tried to convince China to join its side against Russia in 1904, but although some Chinese leaders like Yuan Shikai supported the idea, and many Chinese were glad to see Russia's defeat after their actions in Manchuria a few years before, the Qing remained neutral. In any case, their empire soon crumbles in the revolution of 1911. China becomes a republic, but the new state is nearly as weak as the old one, and soon falls into a state of warlordism, with the central government having little control. Japan seeks to take advantage. It annexes Korea in 1910, and then in 1914 joins the Allies in the First World War and conquers the German colony in China at Tsingtao. Tokyo then presents China with a list of 21 demands in 1915, demanding territorial and economic concessions and a significant degree of control over internal Chinese affairs. Beijing turns to the UK for support, and Japan drops the most draconian demands, and China reluctantly accepts the rest. In 1917, China joins the Allies in the war to gain political leverage against Japan in the expected peace settlement. But the Versailles Treaty of 1919 satisfies neither Japan nor China. Japan feels it hasn't gotten enough, and China resents having to give up Tsingtao. At the same time, there's dissatisfaction in Korea as well, which briefly rises up against Japan with the March 1st movement. The Asian Great Game leaves Japan as the dominant regional power, with a growing empire and an appetite for more. But Japan's rise leads to competition with a new global power in the Pacific, the United States, and few can predict what this new rivalry will bring. We want to thank Beatrice Brown-Arnold, Avery Morrow, Katarina Bondareva, Simon Chilcott, and Nana Sakaguchi for their help with this episode. As usual, you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description. To learn more about the Chinese Civil War, check out our previous episode. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that doesn't want to play great games anymore.